Welcome everyone to our presentation. Today we'll be presenting on our paper called Untitled Spanish, Methodological Issues in the Study of Speech Timing in Chilean Spanish. The presentation is structured as follows. First, we will introduce our theoretical framework, then we will describe the aims of our study, the methodology used, and the results of our research. Finally, we will discuss the results and the methodological implications of these. Speech timing has to do with the rhythmic properties of a language. The rhythm of a language in phonotactic and phonological terms is linked to variation in durational patterns regarding phonemic vowel length, or the lack of this in a language, the presence or absence of vowel reduction, syllable complexity or variability of the syllable structures, and the implementation of prominence correlates. One way to study these properties is by relying on rhythm metrics. These are supposed to reveal certain phonotactic characteristics, such as the variability of intervocalic and vocalic intervals, syllable structure complexity, and the presence or absence of vowel reduction. The most common measures used are percentage of vocalic intervals, standard deviation of consonant and vowel durations, varco-V and varco-C, which are rate-normalized vocalic and consonantal interval durations respectively, and pairwise variability indices that reveal local interval duration relationships. In terms of what has been said in previous research about the rhythm of Spanish, this language has been classified as syllable-timed because there is little vowel reduction, no phonemic vowel length distinction, and a preference for open syllables consisting of one consonant and one vowel. Nevertheless, most studies have focused on Peninsular Spanish, which does not necessarily behave in the same way as American varieties. Several of these varieties are influenced by contact with indigenous languages, which may result in more vowel reduction in some cases than in Peninsular Spanish. There is a high anti-hiatic tendency, which means that sequential vowels either get resolved as diphthongs or monophthongs. There is also very widespread consonant lenition. These final two, we should clarify, are also present in Peninsular Spanish. In the case of Chilean Spanish, what has been said so far is that there is some influence from indigenous languages like Mapudungun, especially in terms of vowel space. There is some vowel length variation, but it is not phonological, and it may happen in contact with palatal sounds in this variety. There is widespread consonant lenition, especially for S sounds and voiced stops. S lenition is connected to socioeconomic strata, and this phoneme is most commonly realized as either the aspirated version or completely elided. Voiced stop spirantization is also very common and can even be seen in some intervocalic voiceless stops. When we were attempting to describe the speech timing of Chilean Spanish, we realized that there were several methodological issues to address. First, some authors have pointed out that the materials used for speech elicitation can influence the results obtained. Also, there are some discrepancies regarding segmentation parameters. In general terms, researchers have followed a more acoustic approach, relying mostly on form and structures, among others. We noticed that there were some discrepancies in terms of whether some phonemes were meant to be included in the consonantal or vocalic intervals. Certain segments, such as prevocalic glides w and y, were placed in the consonantal intervals in some studies, in spite of the fact that they are the first element in falling diphthongs in Spanish. Also, there is the issue of devoiced vowels, which are phonetically like consonants but phonologically vowels. Another issue that is not addressed very often in the literature is what happens with extreme realizations of creaky and breathy voice, which have no clear form and structure but can add several milliseconds to intervals. So why is it important to make clear methodological decisions about these issues? The classification of prevocalic glides into the consonantal intervals may result in higher variation of these. And because there is a strong anti-hiatic tendency, this may mean that several vowel-like sounds get classified as consonants. In the case of devoiced vowels, if these are placed in the intervocalic intervals, it may give the impression that the variety has complex consonant clusters. Finally, excluding extreme realizations of creaks and breathy voice may result in the creation of shorter intervals than what is actually produced by speakers. We will just quickly show you some examples of these realizations. If you notice in the first example, there is evidence of a devoiced vowel, so this issue cannot be ignored for this variety. In the case of breathy voice, there is a significant portion of the sound that has no clear form and structure. Finally, there are several cases of extreme realizations of creaky voice in our samples that can add several milliseconds to vocalic intervals. We will now explain the aims of our research. Our first aim is to study how speech timing is implemented in Chilean Spanish by relying on rhythm metrics as well as looking at some of its phonological characteristics. The second aim is to find out whether choosing different segmentation approaches or the type of elicitation material can have an impact on the results. It is important to mention that this is part of our larger study and that the results are preliminary. For this study, we used a set of materials called Diapics UK, which consists of a spot the difference task between two speakers. This is relevant because dialogic samples are not often analyzed in speech timing studies using rhythm metrics. For this particular research, we only looked at 5 female speakers, but more samples are being analyzed. In terms of our second aim, we created 2 methodological approaches, one which was strictly acoustic, following the guidelines of most previous research, and the second method, which is more of a hybrid approach, where we combine phonological, auditory, and acoustic criteria. These are basically 2 extremes, so to speak, where the second one tries to include as much of the speech sample as possible. We invite you to look at our conference proceedings for a more detailed description of our segmentation method. In this next section, we will show you some of our results. For this first set of results of rhythm metrics, we have 3 graphs with participants here at the bottom, and in the y-axis we have percentage of vocalic intervals, varco-C and varco-V respectively. In orange, we have the results for method 1, which was the more acoustic approach. And in purple, we have method 2, which was one that favored the creation of vocalic intervals, including extreme realizations of voice quality and the presence of onglytes as part of vocalic intervals. So one thing is clear from these first results. Speakers show a certain degree of interspeaker variation. And aside from that, we can see in the percentage of vowels in the samples that method 2 clearly favored the creation of vocalic intervals. In the case of varco-C, we can see that method 2 created less variability in consonantal intervals. On the contrary, method 2 favored more variability of vocalic intervals in almost all cases. In this graph, in the x-axis, we have raw PVI for consonantal intervals, and in the y-axis, we have normalized PVI for vocalic intervals. Here we are showing the results for method 1 in orange, where each of these numbers corresponds to one of the participants. You can see that there is some degree of interspeaker variation between participants in method 1. This variation is a little bit more evident in method 2 here in purple, where participants are further apart in the diagram. If you compare these results for the measures of both methods, we can see that for method 2, the relationships are a little bit less prominent than for method 1 in orange, which may mean that method 1 is exacerbating local duration relationships. We did not expect that this would be the case for nPVI-V, given that this slightly contradicts what we had seen in previous metrics, and we're still working on why we obtained these results. This graph reports the same metrics as in the previous slides, with rPVI-C in the x-axis and nPVI-V on the y-axis. Here we report the average results for method 1 and method 2 and compare these to studies for other varieties of Spanish. So in the first place, you can see that both our results are higher in terms of variability for vowels than most other varieties, but it seems to be similar in terms of consonantal variation. Aside from this, it is very interesting to note that Chilean Spanish clusters not only with some varieties that are geographically closer to Chile, like Porteño Spanish from Argentina, but also with results from other studies that relied on similar elicitation methods. For example, here at the top, the 3 that clustered together used spontaneous speech to elicit the samples, while the 2 that are closer to our results analyzed semi-spontaneous speech samples. All of the others, outside these circles, were actually elicited with red speech. We also wanted to show you some of the results obtained in the phonological analysis. In this slide, we have a graph of the percentages of sequential vowel resolutions that we found in the samples. As you can see, most of the time sequential vowels were either realized as diphthongs or monophthongs, rather than hiatuses, which is consistent with previous accounts. Of course, there are some exceptions, but even in the case of participant 3, we get that the resolution is almost 50% hiatuses and 50% either monophthong or diphthong. The following box plot presents the duration of the possible resolution for sequential vowels, monophthongs, hiatuses, and diphthongs. In terms of duration, hiatuses, as you can see, are either very similar to diphthongs or sometimes even shorter, which is contrary to expectations, and it would be interesting to find out more about this. But the variation in duration between the types of vowel resolutions that we study might be contributing to the variability of vocalic intervals, even more so considering that sometimes we had very big outliers for the different types of resolutions. The following bar chart presents the possible realizations of the S phonemes, either S, aspirated, or elided. What is interesting about the sample is that participants did not produce as much lenition or elision of S phonemes as has been previously documented. It may have to do with the participants' educational background, given that lenition is less common in so-called educated speech. And in this box plot for the duration of the S and the aspirated versions of the phoneme, we can see that the duration of the phoneme is much longer than the aspirated realization, which could also contribute to consonantal interval variation. Now we will discuss our results in terms of our research aims. For our first aim, how speech timing is implemented in Chilean Spanish, we can see that this variety shows more vocalic interval variation than others, but it was not the case for consonantal intervals, at least in PVI measures. In terms of phonological characteristics, there was a high preference for hiatus resolutions in this variety, and there was a high degree of spiralization of stops, which was also observed for some voiceless stops. We also saw that S was preferred to other realizations of this phoneme, and this was contrary to previous studies. So far, our explanation for these results is that there might be a relationship between the phonological characteristics and rhythm metrics. The fact that sequential vowels are realized more often as either diphthongs or monophthongs may contribute to variation, given that the tendency results in shorter and longer intervals than would be produced if the speakers of the sample produced hiatuses. In terms of the results for consonantal intervals being similar to other American varieties, it may imply that some of the phonological processes in Chilean Spanish are similar to neighboring varieties, and this contributes to similar rhythmic properties. Regarding our second aim, what is the impact of methodological choices on the results obtained for rhythm metrics, we can say the following. From our results, we can infer that the materials used for elicitation purposes have an impact on the results obtained, which becomes evident when we compare our results to previous studies. Added to this, when we compare the results between Method 1 and Method 2, we can see that the more acoustic approach does favor the creation of consonantal intervals and had more extreme results for PVI measures, which may mean that the results are slightly skewed when using the segmentation approach. Method 2 was less variable in terms of PVI, but more variable in terms of VARCO-C and percentage of vocalic intervals. It is possible that Method 2, given that it included the voiced vowels into vocalic interval, among others, might be more faithful to Chilean Spanish because it favors less complex consonant clusters, more CV syllable structures, and includes extreme realizations of voice quality which are widespread in the samples. These are obviously preliminary results, and we need to include more data before attempting to draw conclusions. Our next steps include carrying out statistical analysis to see whether there is any causation relationship between the phonological processes described here and the results obtained for the characteristics of Chilean speech timing. So that is the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for watching. We look forward to reading your comments and answering your questions. So thank you again and stay safe.